Assalamu alaikum. There's been a persistent notion for a long time that Prophet Muhammad ﷺ was illiterate. And this segment is to discuss this issue and eventually show you the direct evidence that that is not true. Now, before we start with the evidence, I want to show you a little bit of the information that I dug by doing research on the historical reasons why this notion developed in the first place. In order to understand this, we have to go back to the history of commentaries, meaning tafsir, the books that provided, the opinions of commentators and explainers of the Quran, so-called explainers of the Quran, even though, as we said before, the Quran does not have an explanation per se because it's meant to provide all sorts of new ideas all the time for every generation. Every generation has a right to extract from it whatever different new knowledge Allah guides that generation to extract. Now, the history of the commentators, tafsir, is that in the early centuries there was a need for people to learn about the Quran, especially with the growth of Islam across many different parts of the world. And some of them did not really speak Arabic very well. So a profession developed, literally a profession developed of storytellers who would gather in the mosques, in the masjids, especially after Isha prayer, or between Maghrib and Isha after people were done with their work days and they did not have much else to do in the form of entertainment. So this type of entertainment was provided in the form of storytelling about stories from the Quran or explaining the Quran. I'm not saying that all the commentators or all the interpreters of the Quran were of that type, but there was definitely historically documented professional commentators who did this. Now, this happened after the first dynasty, the Umayyad dynasty, which lasted approximately 100 and maybe around 100 years, 90 years approximately, and followed by the second dynasty, which is the Abbasid rulers. All of these people were despotic in nature, were authoritarians, and they took advantage of the fact that this was a way to provide mass media and frankly propaganda to suit their political purposes. This is true, and some of you may be surprised to hear this, but this is how the profession of providing commentary on the Quran was muddled by such professional storytellers who were encouraged by the state. Now, of course, the state would encourage people who would only promote the quote-unquote official or acceptable version of what the Quran meant. Having said this, the commentators, especially those storytellers, proceeded to bring a lot of explanations, a lot of stories from the Torah, as we explained in other segments before. They proceeded to bring some of these stories from the Torah, and then they applied them to the Quran, and then they started, expanding them. They did not stop at what the Torah said. They dug into a lot more details, and they provided a lot of so-called salt and pepper to these stories. And this is how the general opinion of these stories became totally in line with what the corrupted versions of the Torah and the Bible told us. And therefore, they confused these stories that they brought from the corrupted versions of the Torah and the Bible with what the Quran was really truly trying to tell us. But that caused a problem for them. The problem was, soon after, there was an accusation that was very valid accusation that, okay, Muhammad must have copied these stories from the versions of the Torah and the versions of the Bible that were available to him. And to deflect those accusations, they came up with the notion that he was illiterate, and they tried to buttress their argument by going to some verses of the Quran. So, for example, in verse number 157 to 158, the two verses from Surah Al-A'raf, which is Surah number 7, it refers specifically to Muhammad as Al-Rasul Al-Nabi Al-Ummi, the messenger, the prophet who was Ummi. And they said, this Ummi means that he was illiterate. And they went to other verses, such as Surah Al-Jumu'ah, which is number 62, verse number 2, which says specifically, هو الذي بعث في الأميين رسولا منهم. Allah is the one who sent from among the ummis, that word again, a messenger from among them. And they said, you see, this confirms that Muhammad was ummi, meaning, as they said, meaning an illiterate person. Of course, they did not have the discipline, the methodological discipline, to link the various verses of the Quran to see what the word ummi literally means or indicates according to the Quran itself. They went back to what the poets and what the commoners used that word to mean, and they applied it to the Quran. Now, the obvious question with this last verse that we read, the Surah Al-Jumu'ah, which is, verse number 2, the question is, did Allah send a messenger from among the ummis? In other words, from among the Arabs or from among the tribe of Quraysh? They were all ummis, and if according to their interpretation, ummi means illiterate, that means they were all illiterate. Is that true? And obviously it's not. It is not, absolutely not true. So what is the meaning or the indication of that verse? To understand that verse, we go to another verse in Surah Al-Baqarah, number 78. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَمِنْهُمْ أُمِّيُّونَ لَا يَعْلَمُونَ الْكِتَابِ إِلَّا أَمَانِي. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is describing the people of earlier scriptures, describing them as ummi, in plural, ummis, right? Same word. Among them are ummis who do not know the book, the scriptures. In other words, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is giving us a direct definition in that verse that among the people of earlier scriptures, and that's a general description. It doesn't mean they could read those scriptures, but among those people who followed those scriptures, among them are ummis who do not know their own books. In other words, the definition of ummi is someone who does not have familiarity or expertise, at least familiarity with their own scriptures. And that's the definition of ummi, right? So when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was talking about the messenger Muhammad as a messenger, as a prophet, ummi, he's describing that reference to the people of earlier scriptures. And he was saying, as an evidence to what I'm saying, that verse number 157, 158, which describes Prophet Muhammad as Al-Rasul, Al-Nabi, Al-Ummi, the messenger who's a prophet, who's Ummi, it's describing him as he is described that way in their books, in their scriptures. And therefore, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is using that reference to show the people of earlier scriptures, I told you that such person was coming and was going to be sent with a new scripture. And that was the word, the term that was used about Prophet Muhammad in the earlier scriptures. So that's the meaning of Ummi. To prove this, we go to another verse. In Surah Al-Ankabut, which is number 29, verse number 48, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَمَا كُنْتَ تَتْلُو مِنْ قَبْلِهِ مِنْ كِتَابٍ وَلَا تَخُطُّهُ بِيَمِينِكَ إِذًا لَارْتَابَ الْمُبْطِلُونَ. You never recited before this Quran any books, nor did you pen one with your right hand, for then the doubters would have reason to be suspicious. And this verse is very peculiar because some people neglect a couple of words in it. And they, if you read carefully, you never recited before this Quran any books, nor did you pen one with your right hand. In other words, before the Quran, you did not have any history of writing books or even reciting previous books, meaning you were not a follower of the earlier scriptures. So you did not have access to all the other stories that the other versions of the scriptures have. And this is showing that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is buttressing the idea that in this book, He was writing with his own right hand, not composing it, but actually producing the written version of what was revealed to him. And in this book, he was reciting. As a matter of fact, the very first verse that was revealed to Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, which says read, iqra, does not make sense unless he's reading something. There is something to read. And his answer was, I cannot read, or I'm not able to read. And he was repeated, and then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala provided him a way. So perhaps before the Quran, he was illiterate, but definitely during the revelation of the Quran, and for the 23 years that preceded since the beginning of revelation, he was able to read, recite, and confirm the writing. So this is a very important point, which brings us to the indirect evidences that we're going to present. So the direct evidences I shared with you, that there is no direct evidence that he was illiterate. On the opposite, the term min qablihi, before this Quran, in Surah Al-Ankabut number 48, as I showed you, prove that there is an exception, that after this Quran something else happened. That the verse is talking about before and after. Before he was not able to read or write, after he was able to read and write. To prove this, we go to the actual writing of the Quran itself, which has been preserved, thankfully, for the last 14th century plus. So when we go to the Quran and we examine the writings of the Quran, the way the Quran is actually written, the actual, what's called in Arabic, al-rasm, or the drawing, the actual spelling, the specific characters that are used to describe the words or to represent the words on paper. In Surah Ash-Shura, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala starts that surah with two verses. The first verse is composed of two letters. They're drawn in a connected way, and yet they're pronounced separately. Ha, Mim. And then the next verse has three letters, one word, three letters. The letters are connected also, but they're pronounced separately. Ain, Sin, Qaf. In other words, Ha, Mim, Ain, Sin, Qaf. That's how you pronounce it. That's how you read it, recite it. But the way you write it, they're all connected. First two letters are connected anyway, and the next three letters are, split from the first two and then written connected again. Question is, who told them to write it this way? Now, if you go to another surah, Surah Maryam, it has 5 of these letters at the beginning of that surah, the very first verse. They're all connected. They're all pronounced individually. Kaf, Ha, Ya, Ain, Sad, 5 letters. They're all pronounced separately, recited separately, but they're connected. So in Surah Maryam, 5 letters are written connected. In Surah Ash-Shura, 5 letters, the 2 are connected, then a split, then the 3 are connected. Who told them to write it this way? Of course, it was Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Therefore, he must have been observing and guiding exactly how the writing of these verses must have taken place. Now, the writing of the Quran, those who take the time to investigate the detailed variations in writing, you find a lot of terms that are not spelled in the classic Arabic. There are scholars who are alive today who have been paying attention to these variations and have produced amazing results that prove that these variations are not arbitrary or ad hoc, unlike what some people have claimed. Some people have claimed that these variations are simply because those who wrote the Quran in the early years, that's just how they wrote. And that doesn't make sense, because the same word, sometimes in the same sentence, in the same verse, is spelled in 2 different ways. And that does not make sense at all, unless it was guided by the Prophet ﷺ. So in Arabic we say, al-rasm, this type of spelling, is tawqifi. It's guided by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's part of the revelation of the Quran itself. It is not arbitrary. It was not left up to human beings. It was not left up to Prophet Muhammad himself. In future segments, we're going to dive more into this issue and see the amazing results that we will produce due to this specific discovery. I hope this was helpful, and I hope that we will continue, inshallah, in future segment, and we will see you again. Thank you for watching.